A beautiful Texas woman, 27 going on 28 years old, is brutally stabbed to death just one day before her birthday. And police say they already know the guy who did it. It's her boyfriend, who she just broken up with. The same man who has her first name tattooed on his chest. This happened in El Paso, Texas. It was the early morning hours of Sunday, January 5th, when first responders arrived at this home and they found Dafne Davila in severe condition. Police say the person who stabbed her this much was actually her ex-boyfriend, 30-year-old Jorge Chavez. What we know about Dafne and her relationship with Jorge comes from her family. They've spoken out to local TV stations in El Paso talking about the abuse that Dafne had sustained, all at the hands of Jorge. Again, this is just from Dafne's family, but they do say that she was in an abusive relationship and that she'd actually just broken up with Jorge before all of this. Her family also released a text message that Dafne wrote to one of her family members before her death. I want to read it for you. It says, quote, "In reality, it's so hard for me to walk away and IDK, I don't know. Why? Because old me wouldn't have lasted a second in this place. I know I have you and I'm beyond grateful, but I can't explain why I'm attached. All I ask for is please be patient with me." So Dafne's family says that she had this rocky relationship with Jorge and that he was abusive. And actually, there's potential proof of that. He'd been arrested back in November. A warrant had been put out for his arrest actually in August for a completely separate domestic violence incident. At the time, he was booked. He was released the same day, though, on $1,500 bond. And then again, he allegedly committed this domestic violence act just last week. Here are the details. First responders got a call around 3:30 in the morning on Sunday, January 5th. They arrived to this home in the Horizon City neighborhood of El Paso. They went inside to find Dafne, who'd suffered severe stab wounds. She was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately it was too late and she was pronounced dead. At the same time as investigators were arriving to this home, they noticed somebody leaving the area. It was a person in a gray 2024 Chevy pickup, and that person, of course, is Jorge himself. It took a few days for Jorge to be arrested after all this, though, because he fled the area. He was actually found in Pecos, Texas, which is about 200 miles east of El Paso. After this, it was the Texas Rangers, Reeves County Sheriff's Office, and of course the El Paso County Sheriff's Office that worked together to extradite him all the way from Pecos back to El Paso. That's where he is right now. He's been booked into jail and is there on $1 million bond. But there are still so many details about this case that we don't know. Investigators haven't even released a motive. All they'll say is that it was a domestic violence situation. I want to thank Upside for sponsoring today's Law and Crime YouTube takeover. Upside is a free app that gets you real cash back on gas, groceries, and restaurants. It's super easy to use too. Just claim an offer in the app, pay as usual with your card, and get paid. And this is actually real cash back. You can use Upside at places like Shell or Exxon, 7-Eleven, and even Chipotle. So to find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside, or scan the QR code on your screen and use our promo code LCTakeover to get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. That's promo code LCTakeover for an extra 25 cents back on your first gallon of gas. So this story is just another tragic one we're covering today, and I still have a lot of questions. So for that, we're going to turn to victims' rights attorney and former prosecutor in the domestic violence unit, Elizabeth Parker. Elizabeth, this case is just heartbreaking to me, but right now we don't have a motive. How important is it for prosecutors to find one?
I think it's extremely important to know what led up to this final incident of domestic violence. The history of domestic violence between these two parties, were there prior threats? Was there stalking? Were there text messages, phone calls, emails? From what we've learned so far, the victim's families say that, or they indicate the couple had broken up shortly before this occurred. And I think it's so important for investigators and prosecutors to be able to distinguish this from being a crime of passion versus premeditated murder. So a crime of passion is really one that's committed in the heat of the moment. There's no plan to commit the crime, but it's where someone acts suddenly because they can't control their emotions or their passion. Basically, did the person have time to cool off or reflect before they acted? Versus premeditated. In contrast, that results from somebody planning, plotting, having prior intent, being deliberate about their actions. And here, if there are prior threats, if there's prior acts of domestic violence, if I can't have you, nobody can, which we hear that as a common theme in these domestic violence cases. I think that's going to be really important to support a premeditated murder charge versus, manslaughter or, heat of passion crime.
As you're going through and giving explainers about both of those, I'm thinking it is more premeditation, because we do have her family members coming forward and saying this was a tumultuous relationship. I've seen text messages, in fact, too, where she's talking to her family members saying, I don't know why I'm so attached to him. She's kind of waving a red flag. And then we have her murder just seemingly out of nowhere, except for all of these breadcrumbs that were left along the way. Do you think that her breaking up with him or them going their separate ways before her murder could be part of the motive?
Absolutely. The most dangerous time for a victim in an abusive relationship is when she attempts to leave or when she attempts to end the abusive relationship. The fact that many victims do leave or seek help is truly remarkable, given just all the barriers that they face. There's fear of retaliation, there's lack of financial resources, there's shame, there's threats and increased danger. The cycle of violence that these victims experience is extremely complex. It's very difficult to understand. But domestic violence is never an accident. It's an intentional act, and it's used to gain control. And there are forms of abuse beyond just the physical violence that are frequently part of the relationship. There's abuse that becomes just a part of every normal day life with these victims: the emotional abuse, the intimidation, the isolation from friends and families, minimizing by the perpetrator, denying that they've even committed abuse, and then blaming the victim. So all of those are really important factors to try to understand. It is so amazing that she even had the ability to leave the relationship. But as I said, it's the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence when that happens.
It's so upsetting that that's the most dangerous time, as you said, because these people are standing up for themselves, hoping to go to a safe haven. And it's so scary that when they're doing something for themselves, they could face retaliation like this. You talked about the cycle of domestic violence, and that's something I wanted to bring up here too, because this alleged murderer at this point actually had been arrested back in November for an incident in August. It was a domestic violence situation. He was booked, then released on about $1,500 that exact same day. I'm wondering if now that's prior bad acts that can be included because it's a similar situation with domestic violence.
It's really interesting because you would think that the law would allow. I mean, it's so similar and that's part of the motive. Unfortunately, prior bad acts in criminal court can certainly be taken into consideration when a court is determining bond and when they're sentencing after a conviction. But typically it's very rare for prior bad acts or prior arrests of domestic violence to be included in a murder trial. And the reason is this: there's a danger of those prior bad acts, if admitted by the prosecution in their case in chief, that the jury could base their entire decision or their conviction on the fact that he or Chavez is a bad person because he's committed prior acts, instead of basing their verdict on the facts and the evidence that are presented about this particular case and the evidence in the case. I can see a situation, though, say if Chavez took the stand, tried to say this was self-defense, or tried to say, I'm a teddy bear, I've never hurt anyone, I've never been violent, maybe then the prosecution could use the prior bad act to show that he's not being truthful.
So still a question mark if they would use that incident from earlier in 2024 ahead of all of this. So I guess we'll kind of wait and see about that. But you did bring up the fact that they would include information about the relationship with Dafne, probably hear from family members, go through text messages. And one of the reasons we're covering the case today is because of this very novel piece of information. Across his chest, he had her name tattooed. And that to me stood out immediately. And I got thinking, the fact that this is a domestic violence case, potentially is that tattoo signifying that he owns her, that he thinks he owns her? That's what jumped out to me. What do you make of it?
Certainly, it's in a place that, in the photographs I saw, is very visible in his jail clothes. To me, that indicates possession and ownership. It's a sign of domestic violence when they use what referred to as male privilege, acting, I'm the master of the castle, you're my servant, a sign of ownership. So to me, that is a red flag and a sign of domestic violence right there, that was a part of their relationship, that he owned her.
That's kind of what I was thinking too, and that's really tough. I'm sure that's something that eventual jurors would like to hear, that prosecutors would highlight. But in cases like this, I always have to wonder, is it going to go to jury trial, or could it end in a plea deal? And I know most cases do end in a plea deal. What is your guess about all of this? Would it go to jury trial or end with a plea?
You know, it's really hard to know without having access, to all of the facts and evidence, but much of that would really depend on the strength of the case and the evidence against Chavez. Here we have a victim that's not able to tell her story. She's not able to take the stand and talk about their relationship, highlight those text messages and what it was like, and have the jury feel that fear that she felt. So I think a lot of this would be dependent on what Chavez is facing, what the plea offer might be from the state. Oftentimes we see, though, if a person's facing life in prison, they may force the state to trial thinking, I have nothing to lose. On my worst day, I'm getting life in prison. On my best day, maybe I'll be able to walk free. So I think we're going to have to see how that plays out, and the strength of the case. What is the DNA evidence? What's the physical evidence? What does the evidence, what story does it tell? Because the evidence is going to have to speak on Dafne's behalf.
You're right. It's really going to depend on what we have moving forward. And investigators are still collecting info with this case, going through all of it. And I'm sure they're going to look into the fact that Chavez apparently fled from the scene. This is something I wanted to talk about too. So when investigators first arrived, or first responders, they ran to the house to find Dafne. And at the same time, they noticed him driving off. Eventually, when they caught up with him, he's about 150 miles away. They made note of the fact that he turned himself over, arrested without incident. But to me, that sounds like he was trying to flee. What do you think?
That's typical police jargon. Without incident just meaning, they didn't have to shoot him. They took him into custody willingly. He's at gunpoint and he put his hands behind his back and they put the handcuffs on him without him causing any other ruckus. But no doubt he was trying to leave the jurisdiction. He knew that he was out on bond in the first case. He was clearly leaving the jurisdiction, and he knew that committing a new crime was going to subject him to arrest and he'd wind up in jail behind bars, without bond or without the ability to make bond.
And that is where he ended up. He's now in El Paso in jail there, and bond is set at $1 million. Do you think that's reasonable, that huge, giant number?
Well, I'm in the state of Florida. I'm located in the state of Florida, and he'd be held no bond on this kind of case here. I did some research. The Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution and the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure both guarantee a criminal defendant's right to a reasonable bond. And what's considered reasonable depends on a number of factors. But we need to keep in mind that the purpose of bail or bond is not to punish a defendant for being poor. So it's really to just guarantee their presence at all future hearings. And there was a recent case in, I think it was June of 2023 in Texas, where a trial judge was actually, his decision to set bail in the amount of $1 million on a defendant charged with murder. The case was reversed. So there are several factors that the courts have to look at and rely upon, such as the nature of the offense. Is it violent? Can the defendant have the ability to actually make bond? They take into account the safety of the community at large, prior history of the defendant, the ties to the community, and whether or not they're a U.S. citizen. So the court has to weigh all of these factors, importantly, when determining whether or not the bond is reasonable. Here, I'd like him to be held no bond and not be out of custody, but I think $1 million is definitely reasonable.
I do think that when the court was going through and looking at all those details that you just pointed out, there's no way to ignore the way that this woman was killed. She was stabbed to death. And immediately I'm thinking that's such an intimate way to kill someone. You obviously have to be very close to them. You're exerting yourself. You could, run out of breath. I mean, it's a very intimate and harsh way to die. Is that one of the factors you think they considered, or one that prosecutors are really going to highlight when it comes time for trial or future proceedings?
I definitely think that is something the court had to have considered, how the facts and the circumstances of how Dafne was brutalized. Brutal slaying of her it's an extreme example of an abuser fighting for control. We don't know the exact details of how many times she was stabbed, but as you said, killing somebody with a knife is so much more personal than killing them with a gun. As you said, you have to think about the close proximity you have to be to stab somebody. It's very violent, and it's done typically multiple times to inflict pain and to cause the victim to suffer. So I think that will be a very, very key point and key factor that the prosecution will rely very heavily on.
Such a tragic case that we have to talk about these details. Our hearts go out to her friends and family. This is just a tough one overall. But Elizabeth, thank you for coming on and giving us a bit of your expertise about all of it.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Dafne is being remembered by her family as a loving daughter, sister, and friend. This was written on a GoFundMe page raising funds for her family, and so far, they've raised almost $7,000. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.